Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I am going to show you how I transformed my coral reef artwork into a colorful three-dimensional scene using iLand's UV Resin beach kit that they sent me. My scene includes some glow-in-the-dark jellyfish. Traditionally, the kit is used to make beautiful seashore scenes. While that looks like a lot of fun, it doesn't involve pyrography. I came up with the coral reef idea so that I could merge the two mediums. In fact, I've come up with some other ideas too, and I'll share those with you at the end of the video. Before we get started, I do want to mention that this is not a pyrography tutorial. I will talk about the pyrography briefly, but the emphasis is how I use the artwork with the resin. If you want to see a tutorial on how I did the pyrography portion, leave a comment and let me know. If there is enough interest, I'll create a video. Well, let's get started by discovering what comes in the kit. iLand's kit comes in a cardboard box wrapped in a colorful and functional sleeve, which I'll show you later. The cardboard box is printed with line drawings of items from iLand's miniature dollhouse accessories. An instruction booklet is the first thing we find inside the box. The booklet provides some common sense warnings, a list of the contents found in the box, and UV resin curing and mixing information. Then it provides basic instructions explaining how to create the beach. What I found really helpful were the color mixing recipes, and the inside of the box sleeve provides a place to test your color before you use it. The instruction booklet concludes with how to finish the beach scene and a section on troubleshooting. Next in the box is the 120 milliliter bottle of UV resin. This is equivalent to 4 ounces or half a cup. There's a toolbox, which I'll open in a minute, and phosphor powder, which glows under a black light. Next are the peacock blue and jade green bottles of colored dye for the resin. The kit has a star-shaped bottle filled with assorted seashells and starfish. Look at the wonderful variety of shells found in the bottle. I love the assorted sizes, designs, and colors that are found in iLand's kit. There is another star-shaped bottle, and this one is filled with white sand. Lastly, the top shelf contains a bottle of white cream pigment. This pigment is used to create ocean foam along the shore. Remove the cardboard separator, and you discover the remaining items in the kit. This includes a straw, a small paintbrush, tape, 2 bottles of white acrylic paint, the UV light that has 6 lights, and a USB-styled plug-in, parchment paper, and the shadow box. The toolbox has a dispenser nozzle for the resin bottle, a large spoon, several droppers, a number of wooden mixing sticks, a number of clear plastic mixing cups, and some plastic gloves. Basically, there's a lot in this kit. The shadow box frame has a 6-inch square outside dimension. The inside dimensions are 5 1/16 inch square. The frame is almost 1 3/4 inches deep. The frame backing has hardware so that you can hang it on a wall or rest it on a tabletop. There is a slot at the top of the frame that allows the glass front to be quickly and very easily inserted or removed. My coral reef artwork was burned on watercolor paper. The brand will be in the video description. The artwork is comprised of 3 separate sections: the background, the middle ground, and the foreground, plus the fish. I began with the background. I drew a basic scene onto the paper, secured the paper to a rigid, heat-safe backer, and began burning in the scene. Since this is the background, I didn't worry about crisp edges or fine details. Instead, I concentrated on basic shapes. I want this section of coral to seem like it is far away, so there isn't a need for any specific texture. For the most part, I used circular motion as my burn stroke on the background. I allowed the burn stroke to create irregular color. I figured this would mimic light filtering down through the ocean and striking the coral here and there. The other thing I did was make the bottom of each piece of coral darker than the top. This was done to help them stand out from one another. Once the background was done, I placed a piece of vellum over it so I could sketch out the middle ground. The vellum is semi-translucent, so I can draw the middle ground coral but avoid any background coral that I want to keep visible. The vellum is sturdy enough that I can make numerous revisions without damaging its surface. Once I have a design I like, I remove the vellum and now I have a pattern I can use. With the middle ground, I incorporated a lot more tonal variety and textures. Quite truthfully, when I look at things now, I think I incorporated too much texture. Overall, I didn't do too bad, especially for a first attempt at something like this. With the background, I primarily used medium to large shaders. I wasn't concerned about keeping crisp, clean lines. With the middle ground, I switched to using my smallest shader and writer pen tips. That enabled me to create much finer detail. This is my drawing for the foreground, and at the top of the page are a lot of fish. I will explain their purpose later. The foreground started out the same way as the middle ground. I put a piece of vellum over the middle ground and sketched in the foreground. I didn't record that step. In fact, with the exception of the fish, the techniques for the foreground were almost identical to the middle ground. I incorporated a lot of texture and tonal variety into the coral. Also, I relied on a small shader and writer pen tips to create the artwork. Now for the tedious part, cutting out the coral on the middle and foreground sections. I started out with scissors, and I discovered it was much easier to use an X-Acto knife instead of scissors. I highly recommend keeping the upper edge of your coral simple to make it easier when cutting around them. The three separate pieces are stacked together to show the complete coral scene. I decided that the sand transition on the middle ground was too light, so I reburned over it. I stacked the pieces back together and decided the final placement on the foreground. My artwork is 6 inches square, which matches the outside dimensions of the frame. Someone, who shall remain unnamed, wasn't paying very close attention when they looked that up on the internet. Needless to say, I need to trim the artwork down to match the inside measurements on the frame. I made a cardstock frame to help me decide which parts to keep. After I trimmed the pieces down, then I did a final fit check before proceeding. I created a test piece, and this was done so I could test out different things like fish placement. To create the test piece, I printed my artwork onto heavy cardstock paper. Then I cut out the coral from the middle and foreground pieces. I do know how to have fun. Afterwards, I attached pieces of cardboard to the back of the printouts. Then I placed the pieces in a shadow box that Todd made. The shadow box is nothing more than an inverted cradle board. I have a tutorial that explains how to make one. A link will be in the video description. Once I had everything arranged and glued into place, I applied some actual sand to the artwork. This was done to discover how best to apply the sand, and I found that a paintbrush worked well for this application. Lastly, I placed a few seashells into the sand. The sand was mixed with acrylic paint, which is what the instructions recommend. I wanted to see if it would be strong enough to actually hold the seashells in place. I'm happy to report it does. Here's how my test piece ended up looking. I used very diluted watercolor on the middle ground. I'm using the Winsor & Newton brand. A link will be in the video description. With the foreground, I used less water, so the color was brighter. For some reason, I didn't record any of that. Here is how the middle ground looks, and here's the foreground. After the paint dried, I sealed the front and back sides of the paper with several very light layers of Krylon's matte finish. This was to protect the watercolor from the glue. I'm using Aleene's tacky glue to both secure the background to the frame and seal the frame and watercolor paper. I used a paintbrush to get an even coat of glue on the back of the frame. I made sure to get the glue along all of the edges and corners. Then I placed the coral reef background over the wet glue and pressed it firmly in place. Is tacky glue the best option? I have no idea. I watched several videos on using resin over paper. Each one I watched used a different product, and one of them used tacky glue. I chose to use the tacky glue because I already had a bottle of it on hand. I bent the frame backer during my pressing firmly on the artwork. To fix this, I clamped the backer in place while the glue dried. Next, I applied a layer of tacky glue over the artwork to seal the paper. Again, I used a brush to get an even coat and make sure the edges were well coated. If you're like me, you want to know if sealing the paper is actually necessary. I applied glue to the right angelfish and let it dry. Once dried, the glue imparts a slight sheen to the paper that can be seen when it is angled in the light. I applied resin to the paper. I made sure to cover both the sealed and unsealed portions of the paper. Afterwards, I cured the resin with the UV light for 30 seconds. You can easily see where the resin soaked into the unsealed paper. It gave the paper a wet look, and it made the pyrography lighter in value. I applied the provided tape over the top edge of the frame and along the upper portion of the inside frame to keep them clean. Now I'm ready for my first resin pour. I'm pouring rubbing alcohol into one of the mixing cups. The alcohol will dissolve the resin, so I keep it on hand in case there's an oops. I filled a mixing cup with about 1/4 inch of resin. Then I added 3 drops of blue and 1 drop of green. Afterwards, I used a wooden stick and mixed the pigment into the resin. I did a color check before pouring it onto the artwork. I don't want the color to be too dark because I plan on pouring a couple of layers. I was happy with the color, so I poured the resin onto the lower portion of the pyrography sand bed. Then I used the provided paintbrush to push the color where I wanted it to be. I apologize for the camera angle. I'm out in Todd's shop so I can use his exhaust fan system, and I didn't check my camera position well enough. As I brush the resin over the artwork, I am taking time to brush it onto the dark rays of filtered light. Let me explain further. I circled the area where light is filtering through the water on my artwork. The yellow lines on this image indicate the bright sunlight rays that are filtering down through the water. The blue lines represent the darker burns that define the edges of the bright sunlight rays. Now I'm pouring clear resin over the bright sunlight rays. Then I used the paintbrush to push the resin around so that all of the paper was covered with resin. This blended the color and clear resin a little, but I don't know how to prevent that. Next, I briefly used a heat gun to blow warm air over the resin to remove any bubbles. The legs on the UV light are long enough to reach the bottom of the frame. I placed some long sticks on top of the frame for the light to rest on, so that I wouldn't have to hold the UV light over the frame. Afterwards, I plugged the light in and let it go for 2 minutes. Then I moved the UV light onto the other half of the frame and repeated. I don't know if the light was placed in the center of the frame, if that would be good enough. I decided to play it safe and just stayed with what I was doing. Here's how my coral reef looks at this point. I filled a mixing cup with approximately 1/4 inch of resin. Then I added 3 drops of blue, but no green for the second pour. I mixed the color into the resin and poured it over all of the artwork. I used the included spoon to spread this one around just to see if it would produce less bubbles. I didn't notice a difference between it or the paintbrush. A quick pass with the heat gun to remove the bubbles, and it was time for curing. I'm not going to show the heat gun or curing steps again. Just be aware that they happen after every single pour. Here's how the artwork looks at this point. I added another layer of the blue tinged resin. In retrospect, I should have used clear resin. Here's how my coral reef looks at this point. I poured some glue onto the resin. Too much glue actually, but it worked out okay. Then I placed the middle ground onto the glue and pressed it firmly in place. Sorry that the video is a bit jumpy. The back of my head kept blocking the camera, so I cut out the sections where you couldn't see anything but my head. After the glue dried, I placed the angelfish into the scene. Once I was happy, I removed one of them, placed a large drop of glue where it was, and pressed the fish cutout down into that glue. Then I repeated that with the other fish. I am using a silicone brush for pressing the fish into the glue. If the glue dries on it, it'll peel off. A set of them is fairly cheap. I'll put a link in the video description. Next, I added a starfish from the kit and tried out different seashells. Before gluing any of the shells in place, I recommend checking their placement with the foreground. Once the glue around the shells dried, I placed some sand in one of the mixing cups and added a small amount of yellow ochre acrylic paint, some glue, and mixed it together. Then I added enough white acrylic until I got a pale tan color. I brushed the sand mixture onto the seabed where I wanted ridges to be. Here's how it looks. Now it's out to the shop for a resin pour. I poured clear resin over the ocean section. Over the coral section, I added 2 drops of blue into the resin. I needed more resin for the bottom, so I just used the resin straight from the bottle. Here's how it looks after that layer was cured. The second layer of resin had 1 drop of blue and 1 drop of green. Again, I concentrated the color along the coral and used clear resin everywhere else. Here's how the reef looks at this point. I glued the remainder of my pyrography fish onto the coral reef scene. Once the glue was dried, I used acrylic paint to create a number of really tiny fish. The yellow fish are the easiest to see, but I also painted blue and red ones. My fish shapes are extremely basic. They basically look like tiny American footballs. Back out to the shop for another resin pour. All of the resin pours from here out used clear resin. With the fish sealed under 2 thin, clear layers of resin, it was time to add the foreground. I glued the coral into the frame and then applied a layer of glue over the top of the coral. Once dry, it was time to mix up another batch of sand. With this batch, I just mixed sand and white acrylic paint. No glue or colorant. Then I brushed it onto the sand bed. Also, I applied a fair amount of the sand mixture along the bottom of the artwork. The sand overlapped onto the frame for approximately 1/2 inch in places. The only thing I made sure to do was avoid the slot for the glass panel. Then I started placing shells into the sand. I would often add more sand around the edges of the shell to help anchor it in place. And here's how it turned out. Now it's time for another coat of resin. A word of warning: only use one brand of resin in a project. Until iLand had contacted me, I had never heard of UV resin. Needless to say, I knew nothing about it. So I ordered a bottle online to do some testing with. I was curious how it worked and how it would interact with colorants. We will call this bottle Brand X. While I was creating my coral reef scene, I was at the end of the resin pours for the middle ground, and I decided I wanted to put one more layer of clear resin on it. I grabbed Brand X and used what was left of the bottle for that layer. At some point, Brand X either interacted with the glue or with iLand's resin. I'm not sure which, but it turned cloudy. So I give you this warning so you won't make the same mistake I did. Only use one brand of resin in your project. Use one of the pipettes in the kit and apply a small amount of resin to the surface. Use as little resin as possible. Next, use a toothpick or other item with a small tip and pull the resin down, making little squiggly lines to represent the tentacles. I'm doing this on paper with green tinged resin so that you can easily see how I make the jellyfish. This is my resin test piece. I did a lot of experimenting with the jellyfish. I tried mixing the powder with different types of glues and even brush-on finishes, but they didn't work out. The resin ended up working the best. The key is to use as little resin as possible. I do recommend practicing jellyfish creation on scrap before you try it on your actual artwork. After the jellyfish is done, then sprinkle the phosphor powder over the jellyfish. I used one of the wooden stirring sticks for this. I found that lightly tapping the stick was helpful for dislodging the powder from the stick. Then cure the resin for about 30 seconds. I did discover that you can use either the UV light they provide or a black light if you have one to cure the resin. Afterwards, I used a stiff bristled brush to remove the surplus powder. I activated the powder with the UV light, and here's the resulting glow. You can easily see where my jellyfish are. To fix this, I poured a thin layer of clear resin over the surface, cured it for 2 minutes, and here's the results. You can still see the jellyfish, but they don't stand out as much. And here's how they look glowing. I have to say that I had so much fun creating this artwork. It was so different from anything I've done before. And I know some of you are going to hate it because you can't hardly tell it was pyrography. In fact, if I was looking at it and I didn't know the history, I wouldn't think it was pyrography either. But regardless of that, it demonstrated a way that you could take your pyrography and do something totally different with it. It was just a lot of fun creating this. I think that iLand's kit is wonderful. It contains so much stuff. In fact, if I had another bottle of resin and a frame, I have enough stuff left over from the kit, I could do a whole nother project, maybe even 2. iLand's kit is a perfect way to get introduced to the art of UV resin and see if you like it. I really enjoyed it. Now I did promise I would share some ideas that I have. One of them is a sunken pirate ship. This would be a split scene, so you would see part of the boat sticking up out of the ocean, but the majority of the scene would be under the water. Another idea would be a fantasy underwater scene involving mermaids. I also think an underwater city would be a lot of fun to play around with. So many possibilities, so little time. Well, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.